One of the most memorable scenes from any movie for me comes from the Disney classic Alice in Wonderland. You know this beloved story. It's about a young girl named Alice who gets caught in this nonsensical imaginary world, which turns out in the end to be a dream. Along her journey, she meets a number of interesting characters, perhaps the most intriguing of which comes in the form of a singing, hookah-puffing caterpillar. As Alice approaches the caterpillar, he bellows smoke into her face, asking, "Who are you?" Alice replies, "Well, I don't know. I've been changing so much today, I'm not really sure anymore." Frustrated, the caterpillar questions her again, "No, who are you?" And she answers, "Oh, well, my name is Alice. Pleased to meet you." The scene is timeless because it's a scene you and I find ourselves in almost daily. After all, in a postmodern world, it's hard to answer that question anymore. And simply providing our names just doesn't quite seem to be sufficient these days. If you've moved recently to another state and applied for a driver's license or gone through the process of obtaining a passport to travel to another country, then you know what I mean. I can remember moving here to Georgia last year and getting the DMV's list of acceptable means by which to prove our identities in order to obtain a Georgia driver's license. Marion and I needed a minimum of 3, including our marriage license, our birth certificate, social security cards, and 2 forms of proof of residency. It was one of the most arduous processes I've ever been through to prove who I am. In fact, the only thing probably more difficult than proving one's identity today is getting it back after it's been taken from you, which I suspect is the reason protecting it's become a multi-million-dollar industry. Many of us here this morning likely pay for these services that keep us safe from identity theft. There are organizations that will monitor your credit, provide lawyers to help prosecute anyone tampering with your identity, even help protect you if you happen to lose your wallet. And even then, sometimes they can't prevent your identity from being taken from you. Or at least that's what Rachel Dolezal contends. I was reminded of her story by a recent released documentary on Netflix called The Rachel Divide. She was a self-identifying African-American who in 2015 was the head of the Spokane chapter of the NAACP and taught classes at Eastern Washington University on African-American culture. However, that same year, it was discovered that her birth certificate indicates she was born to Caucasian parents and has no African ancestry. Rachel immediately resigned from her post, inciting both praise and criticism. The title of one news editorial at the time read, "Rachel Dolezal has a right to be black." Who are you? It's just not quite so clear these days. Perhaps even more so for people of faith. For Christians specifically, it used to be that your identity was wrapped up in your denomination. You were Methodist or Presbyterian or Disciples or Lutheran. Even saying you were non-denominational meant something. But denominational loyalty has eroded over time. A more pluralistic culture has created new ecumenical identities, like the person I met who identified as an Anglican Baptist Presbyterian. There are even interfaith identities these days, like Jewish Christians and Buddhist Muslims. Mostly, though, it's hard to have a real clear sense of identity when your tradition tells you that you're made in the image of God. After all, we can never fully know God, which I suspect is what the devil is counting on. And no, I'm not talking about Satan as he's depicted in our reading today with Jesus. Evil never takes the form we think it might, or at least that's what we say. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist. The famous artist Rembrandt picks up on this idea in many of the sketches that he drew of this particular scene that we hear again in Luke today. In one of them, Jesus and the devil look like friends. They appear to be ambling down a country road deep in conversation. The devil a half step behind Jesus. He has a skeletal head but an urgent, deeply human look on his face. Actually, he appears to be reasoning with Jesus, not menacing him. One of his wings is even thrown over Jesus' shoulder in an almost familial manner. He leans in, mouth open slightly, eyes on Christ, speaking quietly, a stone in his hand, holding it out as if it were a gift. It's an intimate scene. Despite his wings, Satan does not look monstrous. He looks to be, reasonable. Which is true of every temptation in our lives if we think about it. All it takes is a little bit of pain or grief or exhaustion or hunger. And all of a sudden what once was unfaithful becomes the only logical explanation. What was once immoral now seems like the only practical thing to do. What was once an obvious no all of a sudden seems like an inevitable yes. Robert Cole spent the summer of 1960 in Mississippi interviewing folks both black and white caught up in racial tensions there at the time. He interviewed a white supremacist named John, spending hours listening to this man who had planned crimes of hate. What made him do it? What made him brag about such horrible deeds? What made this decent man stoop to such evil? Coles later wrote in Children of Crisis, "We must all know the animal in us can be elaborately rationalized in a society to the point that an act of murder is called self-defense, and dynamited houses become evidence of moral courage." Of course, most of the time it's much more seemingly benign, like bread when you're hungry, in the case of Jesus. But it just as well might have been youth or beauty or wealth or confidence or fame or security. Whatever it is that tempts us away from first remembering that we are children of God. Or at least that's what the devil seems to be after in the wilderness. Jesus is still wet from his baptism, during which God has said, "This is my son, the one with whom I am well pleased," when immediately Jesus goes to the wilderness to try to figure out what this means. After all, in ancient times, that's why you went to the wilderness. You went to the wilderness to come face to face with God. And what Jesus seems to discover along the way isn't so much about who God is, but rather who God is not. Or at least he and Satan seem to certainly disagree on their understandings of God. In fact, Jesus says no 3 times before the devil finally gives up and moves on. I can remember in divinity school, my primary text for theology was a book called Not Every Spirit by Christopher Morse. The premise of the book is that theology doesn't start with who God is, but rather who God is not. Because Morse contends Christians were persecuted not for what they believed, that Jesus was Lord, but for what they refused to believe, that Caesar was Lord. The great Mennonite theologian John Howard Yoder based his entire ministry on this premise. One evening he got into a debate with someone at a church meeting. Yoder had been arguing for pacifism on theological grounds. The other man was countering with a just war theory. Finally, the man with whom Yoder had been debating said, "Well, we may disagree, but at least we're both worshiping the same God, right?" And Yoder responded quietly, "No, I don't think we are. What do you think?" Are we worshiping the same God as Fred Phelps Church, Westboro Baptist, which constantly spews hatred in the name of Jesus? Are we worshiping the same God of those churches that still disallow people of color or don't allow women to serve in equal roles to men? Are we worshiping the same God as those churches that preach the prosperity gospel, which suggests that if you're living in poverty, it's because you don't pray enough or don't have a deep enough relationship with God? I know how one of my mentors would answer that question. On the day of my ordination, we were standing outside the church after worship. He congratulated me, and then he said, "Nathan, if you remember nothing else, remember this. In the end, ministry is about saying one word really well." And I replied, "What word is that?" And he said, "The word is no." While he may have said those words in May, he was preaching a Lenten sermon. If you think about it, the church for generations has observed the season of Lent. We began again on Wednesday to remind ourselves how to say the word no. For 40 days we resist something we're giving up, or deny ourselves every impulse, or carve out intentional time to reflect on our relationship with God, which isn't easy, I realize. Like I said, the devil never looks like the devil. Especially when you're as tired and hungry as we are. Yes, just one more drink, please. Yes, just one more painkiller. That ought to do it. Yes, just one more new blouse or new iPhone or new car. Sure, why not? Bring it on. I can do this. Absolutely, no problem. And before you know it, you've said yes so many times, you're not only literally killing yourself, but you've lost any sense of yourself, let alone your God. I don't know about you, but my experience is that it's only when I intentionally say no, or I'm not here, or not today, that I'm able to explore what's really worth exploring. Why am I gorging myself with these Oreos every night? Why am I taking so personally what she said? Why am I so angry about something so small? It's only when we stop running the paces, deny ourselves every urge, and reflect on what's really going on that we can see more clearly something of who God is, but even more importantly, who God is not, and subsequently, who we are not. Maya Angelou was hosting a dinner party one evening. She was mingling with her guests, making her way around the room, when she overheard one of her guests tell a homophobic joke. Instead of ignoring it so as to not make a scene, she stopped, almost frozen in time, and thought for a moment how to respond. She decided it wasn't about who was there. In that moment, it was about who needed to leave. She turned to the group and she said, "Not in my house." And she excused them from her home. You know, I see those bumper stickers that have all the symbols for every religion that say something like coexist. They suggest that we're all one. They're well-intended. My sermon last Sunday was all about all of us being children of God. But that doesn't mean the God we know in Jesus Christ isn't distinct. Or at least that seems to be the case in our reading today. This isn't a God who says yes to everything God has offered. This isn't a God who wants absolute control and power over everyone and everything. This isn't a God who's, needs to prove what God is capable of. This is a God who says no to God's own needs in order to meet the needs of the world. This is a God who says no to human power and strength in order that love might conquer all. This is a God who says no to God's own safety and security in order to save us from ourselves. So who are you? Turns out the answer depends on how you answer who is your God. Or maybe the place to start this Lenten season is who is not.